Autumn in London painted the city in shades of amber and gold. The crisp air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh pastries, making the morning feel almost poetic. But for Isabelle Clarke, there was nothing poetic about running late. She practically flew down the sidewalk, her mind a whirlwind of deadlines and emails. The only thing that could save her now was coffee. Without it, she'd collapse at her desk like a zombie straight out of a horror film. The moment she stepped into Covent Garden Cafe, she rushed straight to the counter, ordering the largest latte they had. But just as she turned around, bam! She crashed into a brick wall. No, not a wall, a man. A very tall, very expensive-looking man. Before Izzy could react, the damage was done. Her latte had spilled, straight onto his tailored charcoal gray suit. The cafe fell silent. Izzy froze. The man simply stood there, eerily composed, but his gaze made her feel like she had just walked into a disaster. Slowly, he looked down at the spreading coffee stain on his chest, then lifted his gaze, deliberately, unhurried, until their eyes met. And that was when her brain officially short-circuited. 3 days after the humiliating coffee disaster, Izzy had almost forgotten about the ridiculously expensive-looking man she had drenched in latte. She had bigger things to worry about. Looming deadlines, unpaid bills, and an overwhelming workload. But when her doorbell rang on Monday morning, she had no idea that her life was about to take a turn she never expected. Standing at her doorstep was a sharply dressed man with an air of authority so intense it made her feel like she had just opened the door for a royal prosecutor. "Miss Clarke?" His voice was steady and formal, more of a statement than a question. Izzy blinked, nodding hesitantly. The man handed her a thick stack of documents. "I'm William Hawthorne, legal representative of Mr. Ethan Wren. He has a proposal for you." Izzy frowned, staring at the papers in her hands. Wait, Ethan Wren? Who? But the moment the name left her lips, a crystal clear memory resurfaced. Broad shoulders, piercing gaze, and a ruined gray suit. Her eyes widened. "He's not suing me, is he? I swear, it was an accident. If he wants compensation, I can have his suit dry cleaned. Wait, no, I can't afford that. But I can—" William remained unbothered by her rambling, cutting in smoothly. "Mr. Wren has no intention of suing you. Quite the opposite, actually. He wants to offer you a contract." Izzy narrowed her eyes. "What kind of contract?" William flipped open the first page of the document and slid it toward her. The bold title at the top nearly made her drop the paper. "Marriage contract." Her jaw fell open. She blinked at the words, then at William, as if waiting for him to laugh and admit it was a joke. "He wants me to what?" William remained impassive. "Mr. Wren needs a wife to fulfill a clause in his late grandmother's will. If he doesn't marry within the year, full control of Wren Enterprises will pass to his cousin." Izzy raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. A reckless playboy with a love for fast cars?" A flicker of amusement crossed William's face, though he kept his tone professional. "Not quite. He has a rather unique passion for parking lots. His grand vision is to turn 100 prime locations in London into luxury parking spaces." Izzy blinked. "You're joking." "Assure you I am not." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "All right, but why me? Surely he has a whole line of women from high society to choose from." William adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Wren refuses to be forced into a political marriage. You have no scandals, no hidden agendas, and—" he hesitated for a moment before continuing. "He also claims you have the ability to talk so much you could make a man choke on his drink." Izzy bolted upright. "He actually said that?" William simply nodded. That night, Izzy weighed the pros and cons. £1 million. Enough to pay off her debts, secure her brother's education, and maybe even buy a small apartment. And let's be honest, where else would she get a story this insane? So, the next morning, she stood before Ethan Wren once again. Looking straight into his unreadable blue eyes, she deliberately tilted her coffee cup, letting a single drop stain his pristine new suit. Ethan looked down, then back at her, unamused. Izzy grinned. "I accept." If anyone believed that weddings were sacred moments filled with candlelit vows and teary-eyed promises, they had clearly never witnessed the marriage of Isabelle Clarke and Ethan Wren. There was no dazzling diamond ring, No heartfelt speeches, no soft violin playing in a grand ballroom. Instead, they signed their marriage certificate in a law office under the glare of sterile fluorescent lights, with a bored clerk chewing gum as she typed sluggishly on her keyboard. Izzy tilted her head, feeling as though she were signing a loan agreement rather than a marriage certificate. Her contract husband, seated across from her, looked as sharp and composed as ever in his tailored black suit, treating this entire ordeal like a routine business deal. He picked up the pen and signed his name without hesitation, without emotion, as if this was just another transaction to be finalized. Izzy sighed, then turned to William, the ever-composed lawyer, and decided to break the unbearable tension. "So, does being Ethan's wife come with a VIP membership at any fancy restaurants?" Ethan frowned slightly, but before he could respond, William, ever efficient, answered smoothly, "In fact, Miss Clarke, you will have unlimited access to all restaurants owned by Wren Group." Izzy's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. Her inner self screamed, "At least there's one real benefit in this marriage." Without another thought, she scribbled her signature across the papers, while Ethan watched her with a puzzled expression, clearly wondering how she was more excited about free meals than about marrying him. As soon as they left the building, a sleek luxury car awaited them at the curb. Ethan opened the door, giving her a silent look of expectation. "Oh, so I get a personal chauffeur now too?" she teased, stepping in. Ethan, as usual, remained silent, simply getting in beside her. The car glided through the cobblestone streets of London, carrying a woman who still couldn't quite believe she had just married a billionaire. Izzy leaned back, staring out the window, trying to process the whirlwind of events. She had signed the contract. She was officially Ethan Wren's wife. But all of those thoughts vanished when the car pulled up in front of a mansion so enormous it looked like it belonged in a royal estate. Izzy's jaw dropped. "Don't tell me this is your house." Ethan, still absorbed in his phone, responded flatly, "Where else?" Izzy could hardly believe it. The estate was massive, an architectural masterpiece straight out of a Hollywood movie. But the moment she stepped inside, instead of feeling awe, she felt a wave of emptiness. Not in the physical sense, but in the atmosphere. Everything was perfect, yet soulless. There were no family pictures, no sign of warmth or life. She stole a glance at Ethan, who walked ahead without a second thought. "You actually live here alone?" she asked. Ethan nodded, not thinking much of the question. A strange pang of discomfort settled in Izzy's chest, living alone in a castle-like mansion, with no family, no friends dropping by. Suddenly, she felt a little sorry for him. But then she glanced at him again, still as cold and unreadable as ever, and quickly shook her head. "Don't get soft, Isabelle. This is a contract marriage, not a romantic fairy tale." Still, she couldn't ignore the reality. From this moment on, their lives were officially intertwined. Living under the same roof with Ethan Wren felt like an endless battle between two opposing worlds. Izzy quickly realized that her contract husband wasn't just cold in personality. He also lived with an almost terrifying level of discipline. Everything in the mansion was so meticulously arranged it felt untouched. Ethan followed a strict schedule: dinner at 7 p.m. sharp, wake up at 5 a.m., and absolutely no room for deviations. The problem: Izzy wasn't built for that kind of life. She loved music, chaos, and working on her own unpredictable timeline. And so, their first major clash happened on an eventful Monday morning. Ethan was in the middle of an important virtual board meeting. The screen displayed the serious faces of shareholders and executives. Everything was running smoothly. Until suddenly, from the next room, a thunderous beat erupted. "Turned down for what?" Boom. In an instant, the entire boardroom froze. The company's CFO choked on his coffee, while the corporate lawyer mysteriously lost connection. Ethan's jaw tightened, his grip on his pen firm, as the bass continued to shake the house. Without a word, he stood up and marched straight to Izzy's room. The door swung open, revealing Izzy Clarke, lost in her own world, completely oblivious to the earthquake-level disturbance she was causing. She had headphones on, typing away while bobbing her head to the deafening music. Without hesitation, Ethan yanked the speaker cord from the wall. Silence. Izzy's head snapped up, her eyes burning with outrage. "What the hell, Ethan?" Ethan folded his arms. "I'm in a meeting with my board of directors." And you're turning this house into a nightclub? Izzy smirked. Well, I'm working too, and this is how I focus. 1 second later, Ethan walked out of the room, leaving behind one furious editor who had just lost her beloved sound system. But that was just the beginning. Next battle? Mealtime. Ethan only ate at exactly 7 p.m., no exceptions. Izzy? She ate whenever she felt like it, even at 2 a.m. One night, Ethan walked into the kitchen, only to find Izzy in her hoodie, hair a mess, eating pancakes dipped in hot sauce. His brows furrowed. What are you eating? Izzy dipped another piece and popped it into her mouth. Pancakes and hot sauce. Want some? Ethan looked at her like she had just spoken pure nonsense. You can't be serious. Izzy grinned. Sweet pancakes with spicy sauce. It's a perfect balance. Ethan shook his head, completely baffled. This is why humans should not eat past midnight. Yet, despite their constant clashes, neither of them realized one thing. They were beginning to change each other. The mansion was no longer silent, and although Ethan never admitted it, he was starting to like it. Everything changed on a quiet evening. Ethan had just wrapped up a long day of back-to-back meetings, his mind occupied with figures and contracts. But the moment he stepped into the mansion, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Usually by this time, he'd hear soft music playing from Izzy's room, or maybe even her muttering to herself while editing manuscripts. But tonight, nothing. Frowning, he set down his briefcase and swiftly headed upstairs. When he opened the door to her room, his heart nearly stopped. Izzy was curled up under the covers, her face pale, beads of sweat clinging to her forehead. Even in sleep, she let out small, pained whimpers. She was burning up. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her bed, pressing a hand to her forehead, scalding hot. A strange, tight sensation gripped his chest. Without hesitation, he quickly called for his private doctor. 30 minutes later, after a full checkup, the doctor reassured him that it was just a fever from exhaustion. But even with that assurance, Ethan still couldn't bring himself to leave the room. He canceled all his meetings for the next day, ignoring the flood of messages from his assistant. Instead, he simply sat down next to Izzy, holding her hand even though she had no idea. That night, for the first time in his life, Ethan chose someone over work. The next morning, golden sunlight seeped through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Izzy's eyes fluttered open, her body still weak but feeling significantly better. And then she saw Ethan. He was slumped over the side of her bed, still in his suit from the night before, though his shirt was slightly wrinkled. But most importantly, he was still holding her hand. Izzy blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Why would a man like Ethan Wren, cold and untouchable, sit by her bedside all night? She gently squeezed his hand. Ethan stirred, his brows furrowing slightly before his eyes slowly opened. His gaze landed on her, and for the briefest moment, relief flickered across his face. Izzy offered a weak smile. You know, you look a lot less terrifying when you're asleep. Ethan let out a low huff, but he didn't let go of her hand. You made me lose an entire day of work. Izzy tilted her head, searching for any hint of teasing in his voice, but all she found was a man who had genuinely been worried about her. She chuckled softly, though her heart ached in a way she couldn't quite explain. Then why are you still here? Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward their intertwined fingers, as if realizing for the first time that he was still holding on to her. And then, in the softest voice she had ever heard from him, he said, "Because if I left, I'd feel like I was losing something more important than work." Izzy's breath hitched. For the first time, she had no witty comeback, no sarcastic remark to deflect the weight of his words. Because for the first time, Ethan Wren had let her see a piece of his heart. After that feverish night, something between Izzy and Ethan shifted. She no longer saw him as just an emotionless businessman, and he no longer viewed her as a chaotic nuisance. Neither of them said it out loud, but the bond between them was undeniable. But things became complicated when Daniel Hughes entered the picture. Daniel was a cardiothoracic surgeon, charming, successful, and, most importantly, Izzy's old friend from university. When they reunited at a cafe, Izzy was pleasantly surprised that he still remembered her favorite drink, even ordering the exact same cappuccino she used to love. "Still a fan of bitter coffee and old books, huh?" Daniel smiled as he slid the cup toward her. Izzy laughed, enjoying the simple comfort of talking to someone who wasn't part of her marriage contract. But she had no idea that this reunion would soon ignite a storm. A few days later, Daniel showed up at Ethan's mansion, holding a bouquet of red roses. Ethan had just entered the living room when he froze in his tracks. There, sitting casually on his couch, was Daniel, talking to Izzy with ease. On the table between them, a bouquet of red roses stood out starkly against the sleek, minimalist decor. Izzy was smiling, saying something that made Daniel chuckle, and worst of all, Daniel was looking at her with a softness that made Ethan's stomach churn. A sharp, unfamiliar sensation gripped his chest. For almost a year, no man had ever brought Izzy flowers. The only bouquets she received were the ones Ethan had arranged, though he had never given it much thought. But now, seeing another man bring her flowers, he felt a possessiveness surge within him that he couldn't ignore. His steps were slow, controlled, but his presence was thunderous. Izzy glanced up and saw him standing there, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. She smiled playfully as if testing him. "Oh, look who's home, my husband." Ethan ignored her. His gaze was locked on Daniel. Daniel stood up and extended his hand, all polite charm. "Nice to meet you. I'm Daniel Hughes, an old friend of Izzy's." Ethan gripped Daniel's hand a little too tightly, his voice smooth yet edged with steel. "Ethan Wren, her husband." Daniel smiled knowingly. "So, you're the one who married her." His eyes flickered toward Izzy with an undeniable warmth. "Do you remember back in university? You were always too busy to think about relationships. But maybe now, things are different." Ethan's jaw clenched. Izzy, sensing the tension, lifted the bouquet with a small smile. "Beautiful, isn't it? Daniel still remembers I love red roses." Ethan's grip on his whiskey glass tightened. Then, his voice dropped, dangerously low. "Do you like him?" Izzy slowly set the flowers down and met his gaze head-on. "Are you asking as my contract husband or as a man who actually cares?" For the first time in his life, Ethan Wren had no idea what to say. Ethan Wren was not a man who lost control easily. He could negotiate billion-pound deals without breaking a sweat, make ruthless decisions that sent ripples through the financial world. But right now, standing in his own home, staring at a bouquet of red roses from another man, he felt an unfamiliar sense of chaos brewing inside him. He spent the entire day unable to focus on work. His mind kept replaying the image of Izzy and Daniel together. What did they talk about? Was she considering his offer? Was Daniel the man she actually wanted? That night, Ethan waited for her to come home. The ticking of the clock felt unbearably loud. It was already almost 10 p.m., and Izzy still wasn't back. 1,000 unwelcome scenarios ran through his head. Maybe she and Daniel were having a candlelit dinner. Maybe they were laughing over shared memories. Or, worse, maybe Daniel would be the one to bring her home. Then, the front door creaked open. Ethan turned sharply. Izzy stepped in, her hair slightly tousled, cheeks faintly flushed, probably from wine. But what made his blood boil the most was the smile on her lips. A storm surged inside him. Without a second thought, he strode over and grabbed her wrist, pulling her back before she could walk away. She blinked up at him, startled. "What the hell?" Ethan's grip was firm, his voice dangerously low. "Where were you?" Izzy raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Are you asking as my contract husband or as a man who's jealous?" Ethan didn't answer. And then, without warning, he crashed his lips against hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't staged for the media. It was a claim, fueled by anger, jealousy, and something far deeper. For a moment, Izzy froze, completely caught off guard by the intensity. But then she felt it. Everything he had never said, everything he had tried to suppress. The hunger, the frustration, the undeniable need. Her hands clenched onto his shirt, pulling him closer. When Ethan finally pulled away, his blue eyes burned with something raw and unguarded. His breaths were ragged as he whispered the 3 words he never thought he'd say. "I love you." Izzy stared at him in shock. She must have misheard. Ethan Wren? Cold, calculating, emotionally detached Ethan Wren just said he loved her? "I don't care about the contract." His voice was hoarse with emotion. "I don't care about any of the terms. The only thing that matters to me is you." A single tear slipped down Izzy's cheek. And then she laughed, voice shaking. "You idiot. I've loved you for so long." And then she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a kiss that was no longer about possession or restraint, but about acceptance and surrender. The contract might have an expiration date, but their love, that was forever. The next morning, Izzy woke up feeling completely different. The barriers between her and Ethan were gone. There was no contract holding them together anymore. Just love. And Ethan Wren, the man who had once been as cold as ice, had melted for her completely. That day, instead of heading to the office, he ripped up their contract right in front of her. "So that's it?" Izzy teased, crossing her arms. "The contract's over, so I'm free now?" Ethan stepped closer, hands settling on her waist, pulling her in. His eyes held no hesitation anymore. "No, Isabelle, this is just the beginning." And 2 months later, on a breathtaking beach in Italy, Ethan Wren knelt before her, holding a ring that sparkled under the golden sunset. "I once thought I'd spend my entire life alone," he murmured, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But then you came and changed everything. Isabelle Clarke, will you marry me? Not because of a contract, but because of real love." Izzy laughed through her happy tears, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. "You idiot, of course I will." And as he slid the ring onto her finger, there were no more terms, no more expiration dates, just love, raw and infinite. 6 months later, on a quiet morning, Izzy walked toward Ethan, a small pregnancy test clutched in her hand. "Ethan," her voice was soft. He looked up from his newspaper, immediately sensing something in her expression. "What is it?" Izzy took a deep breath, then smiled. "I have news." Ethan put his paper down, his sharp eyes scanning her quickly. "Are you okay?" Izzy giggled and held up the test in front of him. "Ethan, I'm pregnant." 3 seconds. Ethan stood completely frozen for 3 entire seconds. And then suddenly he scooped her up, spinning her around, his laughter echoing through the house. "Oh my God, are you serious?" Izzy waved the pregnancy test like a victory flag. "What do you think?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in her life, Izzy saw pure, unfiltered joy in his eyes. He pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, his voice husky with emotion. "I will love you and our child for the rest of my life." Years later, on the same beach where Ethan had proposed, 2 little boys ran along the shore, their laughter blending with the sound of crashing waves. One had Ethan's intense blue eyes but Izzy's rebellious streak. The other had Ethan's jet black hair but his mother's radiant smile. They were currently arguing over a tiny crab, both claiming ownership. From a distance, Izzy stood watching them, a soft smile on her lips. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, whispering into her ear. "You know, I never did pay you that £1 million. Izzy laughed, tilting her head up at him. "That's right. You still owe me a lot." Ethan smirked, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "I already paid you." Izzy raised an eyebrow. "Oh? How?" He tightened his hold on her, his lips brushing against her ear. "With my entire life." Izzy smiled, leaning into him as they watched the waves roll in. No contracts, no conditions, just a love with no expiration date.